lived here in Panmure House. I'd like to do so to remind us why the Scottish Enlightenment is still important for how we understand and confront our world today. There are three features that characterized the Scottish Enlightenment. First, there was a commitment to civilized dialogue on science, art, culture, history, religion, economy, the law, and politics. A dialogue that was based on empirical facts and real histories. More importantly, there was a commitment to continuing conversations on even the most difficult of topics. Second, there was a commitment to education. The more we know, the more able we are to solve problems that support human flourishing. And third, there was a commitment to improvement, or simply the idea that we can progress as a society. But Smith and his contemporaries, who gathered in this very place to debate the problems and issues of the day, were not naive. They were skeptics. They did not take progress for granted, nor assume that all progress was for the better. They were all too aware of the fragility of their institutions. Just as progress could be achieved, it could be lost. There are always fanatics among us. The title of my position here is the Adam Smith Chair in Sustainable Capitalism. For some, the idea of sustainable capitalism draws a roll of the eyes. Sustainable capitalism is an oxymoron, they say. My response is never to say that capitalism is perfect and that their concerns about capitalism are misplaced. Indeed, we should not be naive and think that capitalism necessarily leads to the most optimum outcomes. But I invite them to critical dialogue. We should debate capitalism and its future, what works, what doesn't. At the same time, we should debate what it means to be sustainable, and more importantly, how we become more sustainable. The aim is to entertain ideas, to entertain experiments, but equally, it is to remain aware of the fragility of our world. Progress can be made, but equally quickly undone. But we must still be committed to improvement. Here at Panmure House, we are committed to driving forward a new enlightenment for the 21st century, however audacious that may sound, providing a space for reasoned debate and dialogue, a place of interdisciplinary encounter that examines and showcases the excellent and impactful science of my colleagues across Heriot-Watt University and Edinburgh Business School, and our partners and colleagues across the academic world. A place that connects new ideas to the world of business and finance and the world of politics and diplomacy. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome to Panmure House, as part of our effort to drive the new enlightenment, Colin Mayer. Colin is Emeritus Professor of Management Studies at the University of Oxford. He's a Fellow of the British Academy, the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and the European Corporate Governance Institute. He was Chair here in Scotland of the Scottish Government Business Purpose Commission, and a member of the Board of Trustees of the Oxford Playhouse, the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal, the UK Government Natural Capital Committee, the International Advisory Board of the Securities and Exchange Board of India, and the UK Financial Markets Law Committee Working Group on Pension Fund Trustees and Fiduciary Duties. He was appointed Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2017 New Year's Honours for services to business education and the administration of justice in the economic sphere. He is the author of a trilogy of books published by Oxford University Press, Firm Commitment, published in 2014, Prosperity, published in 2021, and most recently, in 2024, Capitalism and Crises, How to Fix Them. Please join me in welcoming Colin. Thanks so much.
Well, Adam, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. And thank you for the invitation to speak tonight. It's a really great privilege and honor to do so, and to follow in the footsteps of so many very eminent thinkers before me. So thank you very much indeed. And I'd just like to take the opportunity to pay tribute to one other person who is in this room tonight. It was almost exactly 50 years ago that I stepped into his room and sat in a chair in his giant room at St. John's College in Oxford. And I sat down and I waited for him to say something. And I waited, and I waited. And I said nothing, and he said nothing. And then what seemed to be after a decade, he said, well, I suppose I ought to arrange a supervision with you. It was a proposition I couldn't actually refute. And so started what was unquestionably the most important intellectual influence on my academic career. What marked out what was then Mr. John Kay and is now Professor Sir John Kay is the principle that he instilled, a principle that one can sum up as being that one should never presume that what appears to be is or must be. In other words, that one should always question what one might take for granted, and one should never presume that it's immutable, that it cannot be changed. And I think that that is actually probably the most useful lesson that any student, and indeed any individual, can learn. It's very different from what most great thinkers actually teach. They teach that what their ideas are and their knowledge is the truth, the whole truth, and all of the truth. It is, of course, precisely what the great Scottish thinkers and the Enlightenment did. And people like Adam Smith and David Hume very much was of the spirit of questioning everything that was presumed and taken for granted, and were quite willing to throw out what seemed like immutable ideas. And so I think that places John in the category of being one of the great thinkers of the 21st century. So really, what I'm going to be saying this evening is, if you like, my final supervision essay, delivered 49 years late. I think that John might find it agreeable, at least in part.
Always in part, Colin.
Exactly. Capitalism is the most powerful engine that we've ever invented. And business is the most important component of it. It clothes, feeds, and houses us, it employs us, and it invests our savings. It's the source of economic prosperity, the alleviation of poverty, and the growth of nations around the world. But at the same time, it's been recognized as a cause of growing environmental degradation, biodiversity loss, inequality, social exclusion, and mistrust. Every year for the past 40 years, Ipso Mori, the market research company, has undertaken a survey of 1,000 people in Britain as to which professions they trust to tell the truth. And as this slide here shows, alongside doctors, teachers, and nurses, I'm pleased to say at the top are university professors. We might not have much power, pay, or prestige, but at least people trust us to do nothing, earn nothing, and take no credit for it. But as you can see, at the other end come business leaders just ahead of estate agents, journalists, advertising executives, and rock bottom, yes, you've guessed it, are politicians. They come below bankers, trade union officials, and what is termed the ordinary man and woman in the street. And it's been true of virtually every year of the 40 years of the survey that business leaders are near the bottom. Mistrust in business is profound, pervasive, and persistent. And indeed, the Edelman Trust Barometer produces now a survey of trust in institutions around the world. And we can see from this slide that trust in business in the UK is second from bottom of the 28 countries in the survey. This great nation that invented the Industrial Revolution and was the workshop of the world is now the second from bottom of trusted businesses in the world. And you might notice a striking feature that it's not only in relation to our other European competitors that we have less trust in business, but it's true of the developing and emerging world as well. And indeed, if you look around the world, according to the Edelman Trust Barometer, business is actually a relatively well-regarded institution, at least in relation to NGOs, government, and media, which might not, as the first slide suggested, tell you a great deal. But it's certainly the case that in relation to the world position, Britain fares poorly. There's a tendency for people to have a greater degree of trust in their own employers than they have in business in general. Approximately 80% of people surveyed trusted their employer around the world. And there's an important difference in terms of the nature of business, that family-owned businesses tend to be more trusted than those of other types of privately owned businesses, than of publicly traded businesses, and of state-owned businesses. And while it's therefore often difficult to ascribe precisely what one means by ownership, there does seem to be a significance in terms of the relevance of ownership to trust. So why is it the case that there is at least a very ambivalent view, and in many cases, in particular in the UK, a serious lack of trust in business? And I'd suggest to you that the reason for this is the fuel that drives capitalism and business. The fuel is, of course, profit. Profit is both the source of the resources of businesses, and it's also the incentives that drives them. Without profit, there's no capital in capitalism. But we're misconceiving the nature of what a profit is. Profit derives from the Latin proficere, profectus, to advance and progress. And that's really precisely what a profit should be. It should come from advancement and progress. And it often does, but too often it doesn't. And it comes instead from disadvantage and regress. Now, to understand why this is the case, we need to lift up the bonnet of capitalism and look at the engine that exists below it. And this is what you see when you do that. So a measured profit is, of course, the difference between, yes, I realize I was warned about the fact that there's a danger of falling down. Okay, is the difference between the revenue or income of a company and its costs in terms of its employee costs, supply costs, its capital costs. And the difference between the two is the measured profit. But of course that isn't actually the profit of a business, Because what it doesn't take account of is the detriment that it causes, that a business causes to other parties, in terms of paying employees below a living wage, paying people in the supply chain below a fair trade price, polluting the environment, causing biodiversity loss, emitting global warming gases, etc. And in particular, it doesn't account for the costs of avoiding those detriments, and where they do arise, cleaning up the mess that the company is creating. In other words, it doesn't account for the true costs of a business. And if you do account for the true costs, then as you can see from this, the actual, what one might term a fair profit or a just profit, is and can be considerably less than that of the measured profit. And indeed, when the directors of a company sign off their accounts as being a true and fair representation of their financial condition, they're doing no such thing. It's neither true, because it doesn't represent the true cost of the business, and it isn't fair, because it's not then reporting a fair or just profit. But it's not just a problem of an overstatement of profit, there's also a problem of an understatement, because companies can't necessarily earn revenues on all the good things that they do in terms of investing in their employees, supporting their communities, improving the environment, etc. They cannot necessarily capitalize the benefits that they are conferring. But there's a difference, a marked difference between the two. A company can incur the costs of avoiding the detriments or cleaning up the mess. It can't just dream up the revenue stream associated with all the benefits it confers. It has to find innovative ways of being able to capitalize them. Now, obviously, the way in which, as economists, we think about this is, well, these are externalities. These are external to business. They're associated with the markets and market failures, associated with competition failures, regulation failures, taxation, reputation, litigation failures, all those sorts of things. But what I'm suggesting here is that it's not actually external to the firm. It's very internal and intrinsic to the firm, and in particular to this fuel that drives the business, namely profit. And because we're misdiagnosing the nature of the problem, we're prescribing the wrong policy solutions. So competition fails because good companies that incur the true costs and earn a just profit on their business cannot compete against those that don't and are in essence earning an excess profit. And as a consequence, capital flows from good firms to the bad firms that are earning a higher rate of return on their capital. So far from solving the problem, competition or intensified competition can actually make it worse. There's a sort of Gresham law of bad firms driving out the good. And regulation fails because companies lobby against regulation. They employ consultants to help them circumvent regulation and turn it to their competitive advantage. And as for reputation, of course, we're outraged when we realize that companies are not earning profits from creating benefits, but inflicting detriments on us, as we were during the financial crisis, which really came as a true shock to many people. And as we're outraged from what the water companies are doing in terms of earning large profits and paying their executives handsomely from dumping raw sewage into our rivers, lakes, and seashores. Now, while there's consensus around the outrage, there isn't consensus about what to do about it. Because on the one hand, we have the socialist left and the environmental activists saying we need more regulation, tougher enforcement, more taxation. And on the right, the libertarian right, and the anti-woke brigade we have them saying, no, 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 that's an infringement of liberty and freedom, it undermines investment, growth, and employment. So far from there being a consensus, there are strong divisions about what to do in regard to these problems. It's a source of polarization of our societies, and it's giving rise to burdens that the democratic system increasingly cannot deal with or tolerate. So it's undermining both our societies and our politics. And what we need to do is to recognize so that as long as we just treat this as being an externality, then we're not going to solve the problem instead of recognizing it as being inherent and intrinsic to the nature of business. What we need to do is to elevate our sights so that instead of wading, as I put it here, in the weeds of entanglement, exploitation, and expropriation of unjust enrichment, that we shift our views and elevate our aspirations for business to surfing the waves of initiative, innovation, and inspiration that comes from incurring true costs and finding ways of capitalizing on those profit increments that they should be able to earn. And if you do that, two interesting things happen. The first one is that competition does really create a run to the top, not to the bottom, because good firms that are earning a just profit are not now outcompeted by bad firms that are earning excess profits, but by better firms that have found ways of capitalizing on the just profit increment. So we get a run to the top instead of the bottom. But more significantly, what it also does is then to bring an alignment of interest between business that is seeking to profit from creating benefits for us as individual societies in the natural world, and the public sector, which is an interest in the public interest or the social interest. At the moment, there's conflict. There's conflict that we see in terms of the failures of things like public-private partnerships and private finance initiatives that comes from the fact that too often the interests of companies are not aligned with those of the public sector. But by doing this, one creates a natural common purpose in terms of shared prosperity. And by doing that, what one is doing is to encourage the public sector to assist the private sector with finding ways of capitalizing some of those profit increments. And it's not just an alignment with the public sector, it's also an alignment with the not-for-profit and charitable sectors that have similar interests in terms of social and environmental well-being. So what we need to do is to think about how is it that we can actually bring about these desired changes. And at the heart of it is, of course, the notion of why business exists, why we create businesses, their reason for being, namely their purpose. And what this is suggesting is that in thinking about why we create business, obviously profit lies at the heart of it, as Milton Friedman famously said in his doctrine. But what it brings out is that the notion of a profit has to be thought of not as the purpose of a business, but as being derivative of a purpose of a business, of finding ways of solving problems and not creating problems for others. In other words, what a purpose of a business is in this context is to produce profitable solutions for the problems of people and planet. But there's a second part to it, because what we also want to do is to ensure that companies do not profit from excess profits that are earned from creating detriments. In other words, they should not profit from producing problems for people or planet. So a purpose of a business should be to produce profitable solutions for people and planet, not profiting from producing problems for either. And there's an important corollary that comes from that, and that is that if that is what the purpose of a business is, then a profit derives from producing solutions, not problems, for the rest of us as individuals, societies, and the natural world. Now, in terms of actually achieving this, a critical element is to recognize that this notion of a purpose is not about marketing or promoting a company. It's not, as it's been essentially viewed over the last few years by many companies, a promotional device for looking good. It's about the core of what a business does, what Larry Fink described in one of his statements on corporate purpose as being what a business does on a daily basis. It should, in other words, be the fundamental driver of a strategy of a business. And in that regard, it's not vague or woolly. It's precise about what problems a business is there to solve, for whom, how it's going to solve those problems, where it's solving the problems, and why it's particularly well suited to solving those problems. And it's certainly not about corporate social responsibility, doing a bit of philanthropy on the side. And it's not even about environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG, as I'll describe in a little bit. This is about how companies determine their long-term strategic objectives that then get translated into their 3 or 5 year, whatever it is, strategies. I want to illustrate this in relation to a particular example. And the example I'm going to take is of the Danish pharmaceutical company Novo Nordisk. Novo Nordisk makes insulin, which is used in the treatment of diabetes, particularly in relation to what I'm going to talk about, type 2 diabetes. Novo Nordisk used to have as its purpose, its stated purpose, simply to produce insulin and to sell it at a profit. And then it realized that there was a problem with that stated purpose of the business. Namely, that 80% of type 2 diabetes is found in low and middle income countries, many of which could not afford to purchase its insulin. So it started to think again about what its purpose is. And it concluded that actually its purpose was to help people treat type 2 diabetes. So it started working with universities, doctors, and hospitals around the world to identify different ways of treating type 2 diabetes, which might involve taking insulin, but frequently did not. And then it realized that actually its purpose was even more than that, more than helping people treat type 2 diabetes, helping them to avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. So it started working with governments, local health authorities, and local governments to identify changes in lifestyles and nutrition that would help people avoid getting type 2 diabetes at all. Now you might say, well, that's all very well and all very noble, but doesn't it undermine Novo Nordisk's basic business model of making a profit out of selling insulin? And the answer is no, its business actually boomed on the back of it. And it boomed because of the fact that in the process of creating these relations with doctors and hospitals, etc., it created relations of trust by which it became a trusted supplier of advice and products. And its business boomed on the back of that. Now, I think there are 3 important lessons to be learnt from this. The first is the importance of bringing clarity to what a purpose of a company is. The second is no company can really solve a major problem such as diabetes on its own. it has to work with other companies and with other organizations in terms of solving those problems. And the third thing is, if you can bring real clarity to the nature of a company's purpose as a meaningful challenge and problem solving, and you can commit to that, as Novo Nordisk did, then you create the most valuable asset that a company can have, and that is to be trusted, to be trustworthy. Now, I want to illustrate how, in practice, companies can actually implement these types of approaches. In Oxford, we've been working with a large group of boards of some of the largest European and North American companies in terms of how they can really effectively implement a meaningful, challenging purpose in their business. And we've developed a framework for doing that, which we've given the name SCORE to, where the 5 letters of SCORE stand for, in an acronym, for the main components. The first letter, S, is for simplify, to simplify the company's purpose, to bring real clarity to it, just as I described Novo Nordisk discovering what its true purpose is. The second letter, C, is then to connect that purpose with the company's strategy, so it's the overarching framework within which the strategy sits. But it's also about connect in the sense of what Novo Nordisk did in terms of connecting its business to other organizations to help it solve diabetes around the world. The third letter, O, is for ownership. Ownership in terms of the formal ownership of the company, but more significantly, ownership in the sense of everyone in the organization having a sense of ownership of the company's purpose and recognizing what their role is in helping to contribute to the company's purpose. And to do that, one has to have, in particular, an alignment of the culture and the values of the business with its purpose. The fourth letter, R, is for reward, which emphasizes that this is not just about culture and values, but it's about the hard-nosed monetary elements as well, in terms of the financial incentives, the remuneration, the promotion of people in the business, which means that the business has to measure its success and its performance in terms of delivering on its company purpose. And the fifth letter, E, is for exemplify, to bring the purpose to life through narratives and examples that illustrate what the company is doing in terms of delivering on its purpose and its success in doing that, but in particular, to also bring out the challenges and problems that it faces and the failures. Because what is absolutely critical in this game is to be authentic. And that means that one really has to demonstrate that the board of the company in particular, but the whole of the management is really, has a belief in that corporate purpose and is acting on it. Now, I want to illustrate this with another example, which comes from the banking industry, of what has been one of the most successful and fastest growing banks in the UK over the past decade. It's been a bank that has one of the best capital adequacy ratios, liquidity ratios. It needed no bailing out during the financial crisis. And it's also been a highly profitable bank. It's a bank with the highest level, pretty regularly, of customer satisfaction of any of the banks in the UK. And it's also got very loyal customers, which brings out an important element of reciprocity, that if you look after your customers or your employees, then they look after you as a business. But it's not a British bank. It's the Swedish bank, Handelsbanken. And what's interesting about this bank is the way in which it governs its activities. Traditionally, the way in which we look at, or the way in which companies and banks run their activities, is in a very hierarchical fashion from the top, and increasingly so as regulation has imposed demands on senior management and the board to oversee the risks of banks. What Handelsbanken did, starting in the 1970s, was to precisely invert that structure, to delegate authority from the board down to the branches of the bank. And the way in which it was able to delegate that authority and to put trust into people lower down the organization was to ensure that there was an alignment of the values and the culture of the business, of the bank, with its purpose. And it produces a document, and it really instills that document called Our Way regarding what those cultures, what the culture and the values are. In addition, it has a particularly distinctive remuneration structure. Remember how we're always told that you have to pay bonuses to bankers, because if you don't pay bonuses, you can't recruit them and you can't retain them. Well, here's a bank that pays its bankers no bonuses until they retire at the age of 60, at which stage they have a share in the profit-sharing scheme of the bank. It's a very long-term incentive scheme. But it brings out the fact that actually the importance of that is it provides a better alignment between the interests of those working in the bank and the interests of those customers that the bank wants to support, and in particular, its corporate customers, and in particular, its small and medium-sized enterprises. Because what it allows the branches to do is to build up relationships with their corporate customers where the branches do not have to refer decisions up, wait for his decision to come back down, and then tell the customer, I'm terribly sorry, you can't have the loan that you've asked for. They can take decisions about a whole series of things that a conventional bank cannot. And that allows the company essentially to create a traditional relationship, almost a local relationship type bank in the context of a large multinational organization. That, I think, illustrates very well what one means when one says conferring a sense of ownership of people in the organization and ensuring that there's also an alignment of the remuneration structure. That is to say, in this case, that the bonus structure does not get in the way and encourage the personnel in the bank simply to try to act on a transactional basis of selling products at the highest price to generate the greatest short-term profit. Now, critical to all of this is clearly the way in which one measures the performance of companies and financial institutions. And there's been a great deal of work that has been going on in this area, and in particular, over the last few years, there have been a large number of international initiatives in terms of measurement. These have been around the concept of sustainability. And sustainability is one of those terms which appears to be a very compelling notion, but actually is a very confused notion. And associated with that confusion is a confusion around the whole of the ESG agenda and the reason why it's been thoroughly and quite correctly discredited over the last few years. The confusion is essentially a straightforward cause and effect problem. Namely, the way in which most people interpret sustainability when they work in companies in the financial sector, and the way in which one of the most significant international initiatives that is currently being taken interprets this, namely the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, IFRS, is in terms of the impact that environment and society and regulation and things like that have on companies and the risk of companies and therefore the risk of investors. That is what is sometimes termed an extrinsic form of ESG or a single materiality measure of the effect of environment and society. It's the impact on the risk from the perspective of investors. It's, in other words, essentially just another risk category of investments. Now that is very different from what many people think that ESG measurement is doing or is supposed to be doing, which is exactly the reverse causality. That is to say, what is the impact that the company is having on the environment and on society, etc. And that's the approach, basically, that the European Union has taken in terms of the various directives that it's brought out, and Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, and all the other various names and titles that are put to these initiatives. And what that seeks to do is to say, what is the impact that companies have on the risks that they impose on the environment, on society, and on individuals? So that companies are supposed to report on, for example, the extent to which they are embracing or violating human rights in their supply chains, the extent to which they are imposing environmental detriments in the process of their activities. Now you might think, well, that actually gets a little bit closer to what one is trying to do, but actually what this is doing is introduce a great deal of additional confusion, because it's essentially trying to place far too much weight on measurement in terms of what standard measures can do, when in fact the relevant measures are very much those at the individual company level, not some things that you can standardize at an international level. Furthermore, what this is doing is basically to raise the costs of companies, and therefore companies in Europe are very concerned that they're not going to be able to compete on an international level once these forms of reporting are introduced. And thirdly, and most significantly, it's all too damned complex. People just cannot grasp, understand the significance of these differences between extrinsic and intrinsic and single materiality and double materiality. It's gobbledygook to most people. We need something that is much more straightforward and simple that people can grasp. And what I suggest to you is that the notion of a purpose of not profiting from imposing detriments is something that everyone can grasp. Profit without harm is basically the bottom line measure. And people quite reasonably think that that is what companies are doing or should be doing. That's why there's the outrage when you discover that they're not. And to do that, they should incur the costs of doing that, and they should measure the costs in a very straightforward, the most basic form of accounting, namely cost accounting way of ensuring that they are actually reflecting that in their measured profits and incurring the true costs. Now you might say, well, okay, this all sounds very well, but it does sound a bit like pie in the sky, wishful thinking, academic dreaming that we could ever get to this. But I'd just like to say that actually this is not only practical, it's not only that it's happening and companies are doing this, it's actually been going on for a long period of time. In 1936, Henry Wellcome gave his company, I shouldn't say sold, gave his company not to his heirs, his children, but he put it in a foundation. And the Wellcome Foundation, which then became the Wellcome Trust, grew to become one of the largest charitable foundations in the world and has basically become the savior of British science and medical research in this country. And his company, the Wellcome Pharmaceutical Company, thrived over the subsequent 40 or 50 years until in 1986 the Wellcome Foundation began to sell shares in the Wellcome Pharmaceutical Company, and in 1996 it sold its final block of shares to Glaxo to form Glaxo Wellcome, that then merged with SmithKline Beecham in 2000 to form GlaxoSmithKline GSK, a successful British pharmaceutical company. Now, the importance of this is that the Wellcome Foundation and Company is an example of what is termed an enterprise foundation. That is to say, lots of companies have foundations for charitable purposes, but what this is an example of is a company that is actually owned by a charitable foundation. And there's one country in the world where there is a greater prevalence of these enterprise foundations than anywhere else. It's a country that happens to be one of the highest levels of GDP per capita, one of the lowest levels of inequality, one of the best employee relations, and one of the happiest countries in the world. And it also happens to have the company which has now got the largest stock market capitalization of any company in Europe. The country is Denmark, where some 50% of the stock market value of the Danish stock market is accounted for by these enterprise foundations. And the company is Novo Nordisk. That company, Novo Nordisk, which I was talking about earlier on, has just overtaken LVMH as the company with the largest stock market capitalization in Europe. And the reason why it's done that is that in the process of trying to find ways of helping people treat type 2 diabetes, it of course realized that a critical element was diet, and so it stumbled across a drug which is now called Wegovy, a drug for losing weight, which has become a blockbuster and propelled Novo Nordisk into the top ranks of market capitalization. Now, what has allowed Denmark to really achieve this outcome in terms of its success is that it has a system essentially of corporate law, which is called enterprise foundation law, which ensures that the foundations perform their purpose, that they're essentially engaged investors in upholding the purposes that the founders of the businesses wanted to be upheld and therefore used a foundation to ensure were upheld. And it's also a form of law which ensures that the foundations, the owners, do not exploit their privileged position of being a charity and act in the social interest. Now, what I think this emphasizes very clearly is the notion that there are several elements associated with what it takes to really create a purposeful business, and one that is designed and organized to solve major problems in a profitable fashion. I've talked to you briefly about some of those elements in relation to law and ownership, in relation to governance and measurement. There are many others which I discuss in my book, and I would like to be able to cover But I'm afraid I've run out of time, and all I can do is therefore ask you to please read the book. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll start out with asking you a question. I'll try to make it hard, but not as hard as the question that John Kay is thinking about right now. I always wait for John to give a good, hard question. So what I like about your framework is the simplicity of it. Like what you say about ESG and the regulations, it's all gobbledygook, it's difficult to understand. And what you're saying is we just need to change purpose. But it's still cutthroat capitalism on a global sense. Oh, yeah. And there's still a lot of bad actors, and there's still hedge funds that see a dollar lying on the street and they're going to pick it up, and they might manipulate things so that they can pick it up. Yeah. How do you ensure that the good companies that take on a purpose that is solving problems for profit are not then freeloaded on by the bad actors that create the problems, right? So how do you create that?
Okay, so that is exactly the problem that I was illustrating diagrammatically up there in terms of capital flowing from good firms to bad firms. And that is a problem unless one has a law that essentially ensures that companies have a duty to adopt a purpose, and all it requires is for the company to specify that it is profiting from not creating detriment. That's basically the only addition that one needs to add to the Freeman Doctrine or to incorporate in company law to do that. And one of the interesting features of UK law is that it basically states that. You know, we have what is termed an enlightened shareholder value notion of corporate law, which says that a company should promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole, and in so doing, have regard to the likely consequences of any decision in the long term, and its impact on, that follows a whole list of stakeholders. Now, if you interpret it as, one might quite reasonably interpret it as saying that, well, what that means is companies should promote the success in terms of their profit, but only insofar as they're not imposing detriments on other stakeholders, then the law is basically saying exactly what I'm talking about here. At the moment, it's interpreted as saying, no, that's not what is meant. What is meant is that a company should only take account of the interests of its employees to the extent that that benefits its shareholders. So courts can basically reinterpret, without having to bring about a change in statute, the way in which the law is intended and the way in which the law can most appropriately oversee the activities of companies. And indeed, if you look at the Corporate Governance Code in the UK, it basically says exactly that. What the Corporate Governance Code says is that the directors of a company must establish a company's purpose, values, and strategy and ensure that they're aligned with its culture. The board of the company should act with integrity, lead by example, and promote the desired culture. And they should measure their performance against their success in delivering on that. That's basically exactly what we need. So we have the law, which could be interpreted that way. We have the governance codes that could be interpreted that way. We don't have to basically change anything. We just need to ensure that those things are effectively implemented by courts and by the relevant regulatory body. Okay, so that's the way in which it can be done. Now, if you say to me, that's all very well, but what about the rest of the world that isn't so enlightened in terms of its laws? What we are beginning to realize is what I was talking about in relation to the EU and the effect that the EU is likely to have on European companies in terms of the disclosure and regulation it's introducing. That effect will not just impact on European companies, it will impact on basically virtually any international company that has doing any operations anywhere in Europe. They will have to recognize that they have to adhere to the EU rules within the European Union. So there is what is termed a Brussels effect, by which what happens is what's legislated in Brussels has an impact around the world. And what this is saying is that once a significant bloc like the EU really takes this on board, and what I was saying was that I don't think that the EU, although it's got the right intentions, is doing it the right way. It should be doing it through corporate law. But nevertheless, once a bloc like the EU starts to do this, it can basically begin to permeate around the world.
But just to follow up before I turn it to the audience for questions is, so what's gone wrong if what you're saying is already codified and the courts have interpreted it incorrectly? You could say that, well, the corporations are always going to have the high-powered lawyers that will come and help the courts interpret it to their direction, right? So it's not enough to change the regulation or change corporate law. How do we get to that broader cultural shift within the management profession, the business leaders that are so low on the list? What is necessary to shift minds and the mindset of corporate leaders, their investors, without falling into the kind of activist trap of we need to completely revamp the system?
What immediately changes the mind of directors is when their investors change their mind. And the reason why companies began to move in this direction prior to basically the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that that had on energy companies was because the investment community was beginning to take this stuff seriously. And then we had the effects of the inflation, the energy crisis, etc., and attitudes changed. What will really bring about a change in behavior of companies is when investors begin to see that actually the most successful companies are the Novo Nordisks of this world, that there is something in this purpose notion, that it actually delivers commercial value and higher rates of return, then we begin to see investors taking this seriously. And one of the points that I think it's worth bearing in mind, this isn't just about Novo Nordisk. You know, what is sometimes termed the Magnificent Seven, the 7 largest companies by market capitalization, they're basically the US high-tech companies. Those are driven by incredibly purposeful founders, leaders, etc., which really are looking to solve major problems. Now, in many cases, they create lots of problems as well, but they are ambitious in terms of what they're seeking to do. The big failure we've got in Britain is we don't have people with that level of ambition, and where we do have people with that level of ambition, at the moment the financial sector doesn't move in behind them to support them, and they go off to America to get financed instead. But that is indicative of the fact that this is something that increasingly is going to be recognized as a fundamental driver of commercial success. And then you'll get a big switch in terms of the way in which companies respond as well as the investors.
Right. Okay, so I'd like to open the floor to questions. John's working on his difficult question, I can tell. No pressure, John. This was his final essay for you, right? So we have a hand in the back. So if you wait for the microphone to go around, so the hand in the back and then.
Hello, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I just want to add another example on top of the example you have provided, but in this time, a country. So I'm originally from Rwanda, in a tiny country in Africa, and our president, Kagame, and after the genocide, has embraced a lot of the points you have mentioned. Now, it's not liked by Western media, and by some people, it's always criticized for lack of freedom of speech and what have you, but the people don't really care. Because if you look at the indicators and the vision, he has really lifted that country to a progressive one that is becoming quite an example in East Africa. Now, my question is, I mean, Adam Smith was, if you look at America, they use the freedom of market at global level as what drives capitalism, and they defend that. So my question is, what is the role of globalization and migration? To what extent it has created some of the, I don't know if I can call problems in terms of, for example, cheap labor, competition in labor. You gave an example about the water sewage in London. These are perhaps foreign institutional investors who don't care about the local needs. So back to the question, extent of globalization, migration. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And the answer is absolutely. The way in which multinational operations have operated to date is exactly along those lines. You know, for many years, it was basically about seeking cheap labor around the world and exporting activities to the lowest cost providers. And there's still a large element of that in terms of multinational behavior. But what I'm talking about here is precisely the way of addressing that. And remember how I described the Handelsbanken case was of a multinational organization that is essentially creating local banks in each of its branches. And the way in which it's doing that is to empower people in those branches. Now, if you think about this can be applied in any multinational corporation. So, for example, when energy companies or resource extractive companies are saying that, well, you know, they're really taking account of and caring for the communities from which they're extracting resources, and you know full well they're doing no such thing. This is basically saying it is not impossible for them to get this right. And many people who work in the various subsidiaries of those organizations know full well the damage that they're creating, but they're not empowered to do anything about it. What this is basically saying is, if the purpose of an energy company is, as it should be, to solve our energy problems, which means a combination of not solving our energy problems through environmental degradation or through exploiting the local communities from which resources are extracted, then an objective of the company is to ensure that they have the information on whether or not they really are benefiting or causing serious detriment to the environment or to the local communities in which they're operating. And it therefore transforms the nature of what a multinational business means. It means that it's just a set of local businesses that are operating according to a common culture which respects the differences in the local community cultures, but really emphasizes the notion of what it means to profit from solving, not creating problems. So I think it's actually a very powerful way of dealing with the multinational issues.
There's a question over here.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was actually interested very much in the energy example you've illustrated. So if you take an oil company at the moment, how do you suggest it affects that transition now? And I'm particularly thinking of the pressure on a lot of energy companies at the moment for investors to disinvest from them, leave all the fossil fuels in the ground. So within your framework, if you're a big multinational energy company at the moment, an Exxon or a BP or something, how do you implement the framework within that context?
Okay, well, let me illustrate by what happened in the energy crisis when basically from 2018 onwards, the fossil fuel companies were rapidly trying to become energy companies that were solving energy problems in environmentally friendly ways. And then with the energy crisis, not unreasonably, they turned on the fossil fuel taps again, and they earned large profits from the surge in energy prices that took place. And they could have, in response to that, have said, right, okay, these massive windfalls that we're enjoying will be put towards two things. One of which was ensuring that we actually accelerate the energy transition, because what we're currently doing is necessarily creating more fossil fuel output, but that's worsening the CO2 emissions, so we're actually going to accelerate our investment in renewables to negate that effect. And secondly, to say, well, in the process of earning these excess profits, we're imposing a lot of hardship on, in particular, disadvantaged and low-income households, so we will find ways of helping to support them and thereby create a just transition, as it's put. What they actually did was, as you know, they simply paid out the excess profits as dividends and stock repurchases. Now that's really indicative of the notion of what is the difference between an energy company that is really serious about trying to solve energy problems in a fair and environmentally sustainable way, and one that's not. And so in thinking about, well, what should the energy companies be doing going forward, so long as there is an energy supply problem, then clearly you do have to determine where you are finding adequate resources from. But that allows you then in turn to actually achieve more rapidly an objective of also creating social and environmental benefits. That's what we've not observed. Right, we're going to get it.
Now, Sir John Kay.
Well, instead of eviscerating that, I will say that was a first-class essay, and do the other thing that a supervisor can do, which is to suggest an additional reference you might pursue. And the reference is to the legal case of Arkansas teachers and others versus Goldman Sachs. And the basis of this case is the ethics statement of Goldman Sachs, which began and still does begin, our client's interests always come first. The legal action is on the grounds that Arkansas teachers and others were misled by this into thinking that Goldman Sachs was a suitable investment for their funds. The Goldman Sachs defense, perhaps unexpectedly, is not that this statement is true, but that the statement is so obviously not true that nobody could reasonably invest on the basis of believing it was. And actually that defense has succeeded, and interestingly, the lead Goldman attorney, commenting on the dismissal of the case, says that he was relieved, his client is very relieved because it did not feel it had made any misstatements. I think that reference has a number of lessons for us, but I pick up two, one of which is it makes it very easy to understand some of the data you presented at the beginning of your talk about the lack of trust in big business. If this kind of hypocrisy is institutionalized, and it is institutionalized, the American Chamber of Commerce filed a document in support of Goldman that said all companies make statements of this kind. If the finding of the initial finding of the court were upheld against Goldman, they would do so in future at their peril. I didn't consider the possibility that they might instead ensure that the statements were true, or at least bore some relation to the truth. The other is that statements of purpose and values have no point unless they're actually internalized in the behavior of people in the organizations. And that, I think, is the lesson we should all take away from this talk.
Did you want to say anything to John? I mean,
No, I mean, that Goldman Sachs case is a wonderful example of how there is deep cynicism about the notion of what the use of purpose really is, and that it's not just that companies are willing to mislead people, but they're actually willing to engage in activities that if they went home and behaved in that way at home, they would deem it to be completely unacceptable. And one of the things that I think we need to recognize is, and this was particularly illustrated by banks, not just by Goldman Sachs, is that what happened during the financial crisis and afterwards was that people were behaving in ways that they wouldn't dream of behaving in a personal capacity. And we need to reflect on that a little bit, because in some respects we actually take it for granted that that might happen, that, you know, well, business is about business, it's a cutthroat activity, so, well, you know, people have to behave in a different way in their corporate environment. I don't think that's true at all. And I think the feature of the companies that are the most successful companies are the ones that do exactly the converse. You know, I sometimes describe this in terms of two phenomena, which I call syntegrity and saintegrity. And that is that organizations can either, in essence, intensify Homo economicus in terms of us being lazy, greedy, and selfish through the nature of their cultures and their values. Or they can do exactly the opposite. They can actually convert what would otherwise be selfish individuals into individuals that recognize they're working in a community, and they're working in a community where they're expected to demonstrate higher standards of activity and behavior. And that's what I mean by saintegrity. And that's what I think the best organizations do. And that is precisely what I feel we should be able to expect from business, not to regard it as an anomaly by some quirky businesses that might do this. But that is, in effect, what we anticipate that the majority of businesses around the world do.
It should be the Atticus Finch statement of I can't behave one way at home and a different way in town.
Exactly.
So, Michael?
Just to reiterate, it's a fantastic lecture, I thought. I was just wondering how you personally would define profit without harm. I'm interested because if we look at the height of the ESG sort of agenda prior to Ukraine, lots of firms were complaining about they were being forced to, or facing disinvestment because they had contracts for things in the defence sector, or contracts even in prison services. Is that profit without harm or with harm?
Profiting from being in the defence sector, or?
Yeah, well, just the fact that these were targeted under the ESG
Right.
For being
right. Okay.
Sorts of being harmful.
So this is an illustration of why I think ESG is nonsense. Okay, because you try to apply these broad categorizations to activities, and then you find you're tying yourself in knots, because actually, you know, there are exceptions to the fact that obviously having defense in some areas is desirable, in other areas it's undesirable. And what it brings out is that the notion of harm is something that is very specific to a company. And the notion of whether or not it's benefiting its customers or its employees or society is specific. You can't have generalized measures that apply across companies as a whole, or international standards that are being set, except for in a very limited number of cases. You know, CO2 emissions is one of the few cases of where one might be able to actually justify some sort of international measurement. But in general, one has to, and these are closer to being essentially KPIs, key performance indicators of companies, which extend the notion of what a key performance is for a company beyond just producing its output, producing its widgets, but recognizing the way in which the company is impacting on other people as being a key performance measure. And of course we have some of those in terms of safety of the employees, But we don't recognise that this should be something that's just generic. It's not just where the law in particular specifies that companies should demonstrate an element of care. We should recognise that alongside the fiduciary duty of directors to their shareholders, and what I'm talking about here does not try to broaden that notion of the duty of directors beyond that to shareholders, but it recognises that that duty is discharged in such a way that there is care taken in relation to the impact of the company on other parties. And that is the key element that we fail to recognise as really being what was, I think, intended or should have been intended by this enlightened shareholder value notion, that bit about and have regard to the impact on other stakeholders, meaning taking care of the impact that the company is having on those other stakeholders.
We have time for one more question. Richard had his hand up first, so we'll take two questions, then Claire.
Thanks so much for your lecture. I have learnt from the examples that you've said that there are two very significant levers of purpose. One, through the pharmaceutical example, was the lever that the consumer or the network of the purchasers had in adopting and buying the product. And secondly, you gave the example of purpose-led companies where shareholders choose to invest. I just wondered if I could go into the world of, say, commodity metals, which is my area, in particular critical metals for the electric economy. Do you think that the only way to deliver a purpose-led agenda amongst the mining corporations will be through shareholders that want to invest in mining companies with a purpose versus for commodities, I'm thinking consumers probably won't really have that power? Or do you think the world may change such that the purchasers of batteries or cars or phones will exert power in a commodity market for metals? And I have said, I have observed in the mining companies this wave that you've described where a number of them were leaning in to being purpose-driven, and actually a number recently have moved out from that domain. So I was interested really for commodities, where do you think the levers will pull through?
We'll take Claire's question first, and then you.
Thank you. Hello, and welcome back to Edinburgh. I think 2 years ago you were here for the launch of the Business Purpose Commission. Since then, we've had some sort of quite significant corporate breaches of trust. I'm thinking of things like the post office scandal, for example. But we're also looking at potential change of government in a few weeks. And I suppose my question is, in the 2 years since we launched the Business Purpose Commission, do you feel more or less optimistic about the future of purposeful business?
Okay, so on the commodities and metals question, the answer is that there is an immense amount of potential that can come from procurement, from corporate purchases, and also from public procurement. And one of the big levers that I think we can in general use is to recognise that something like 15% of UK GDP is accounted for by public procurement. This is potentially a very powerful way in which the government can rapidly encourage companies to move in this direction of saying that they'll only procure from companies which explicitly state that they are, in this case, producing the resources in a way that's not destructive of the local communities. But I think that already the potential of the Apples and the Teslas, etc., to do likewise is considerable. So that I wouldn't understate the element that can come from the customer side rather than the consumer side in terms of that power. But ultimately, as I was saying elsewhere, it has to be that investors see the potential financial benefit associated with this for boards to be convinced, and that's exactly why they've been moving in the opposite direction, because the investing body has been moving in the opposite direction. On the Scottish Business Purpose Commission, which I was very fortunate to co-chair with Amanda Young, I think this is a tremendous opportunity for Scotland to get that agenda pushed forward. And I think you should all be going out and asking in particular the SNP and the Labour Party and whoever else you think's got any chance in Scotland to say exactly to what extent are they actually going to do things to pick up what we said on the Business Purpose Commission, because it was I found it a remarkable body to be involved with, because what came across to me was a sudden realization that people began to understand what corporate purpose is about. You know, the notion of corporate purpose is actually very boring to people. It sounds as if it's, you know, just business thinking about ways of trying to do things even more profitably for itself. What came out from the Business Purpose Commission, which comprised people from Scottish business, Scottish investors, civil society, trade unions, so it was a broad range of people. And they really came together in terms of recognizing that these notions of corporate purpose are something that can create a notion of common purpose, a common purpose between not just investors and businesses, but between government, investment, business, civil society, etc., around creating shared prosperity. Okay? And I think that because Scotland has set up this commission, it could really lead the way in implementing this, notwithstanding that, you know, unfortunately it doesn't have devolved powers in relation to corporate law. But as I was saying, I think there's enough flexibility within the existing corporate law to do this, if there's the will to do it. And I think what was set out in the final report actually makes very clear what it takes to take the agenda forward. And I would be, you know, really hounding the political parties at this moment and to get them to tell you, well, what are you going to do about this commission?
Well, I think that's a good call to action for here in Scotland to end on. So let's please give Colin a round of applause again. And the best part is there's Colin's book. You were thinking I'm going to say drinks downstairs. There are drinks downstairs. But there are all copies of his book, and he'll sign it for you. And so thank you for coming. If this is your first time to Panmure House, I hope you enjoyed your time here, and I hope you come again. If it's your 5th visit, I hope you still enjoyed it, and I hope you do come again, because we're going to do more of these events as we develop and become part of the debate on how to fix capitalism for the better. So thank you, Colin, and thank you, everyone, and have a good evening.